There we go. So today we are going to be doing a very cumulative lecture on the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. As always, unfortunately, we won't be able to discuss everything, but we are going to highlight some important key events that happened over these 20 years in terms of the advocacy and assertion of African American rights. So that is the name of the lecture. Make sure that's at the top of your notes, and we'll go ahead and get started. So I should also do this. As we discussed when we covered World War II, the 1940s is very much a start to the civil rights movement. As we discussed when we covered World War II, you have people like A. Philip Randolph and CORE, I always say that their thing wrong, the Congress of Racial Equality. So again, you have A. Philip Randolph and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, fighting against racism, especially in the federal government and the military. And you also have the NAACP, which was founded in 1909, focusing on a legal strategy to combat racism. So again, the NAACP uses a legal strategy. And in 1943, we have one of our first marches on Washington for African American civil rights. So again, 1943, there is a march on Washington. And in this march, African Americans advocated for an end to segregated hiring in the federal government. So again, in this march, African Americans are advocating for an end to segregated hiring by the federal government. So again, these are the seeds for the civil rights movement that we commonly refer to, and we're going to cover today. One of the first major victories of the civil rights movement is in Brown versus Board of Education. As I stated earlier, the NAACP worked on legal strategies to end segregation. And one of the major things that the NAACP fought against was the treatment of Black children in schools. In 1952, 5 cases regarding racial segregation in schools were brought to the Supreme Court under the name Brown versus Board of Education. So again, these 5 cases get combined into one under this label. In this case, lawyer Thurgood Marshall So again, the lawyer's name is Thurgood Marshall, and he becomes a Supreme Court justice later in his life. He attacks segregation in schools and says it's unfair application of the separate but equal doctrine. Or he argues that the separate but equal doctrine is unfair. Marshall argues that a lifetime of segregation undermines children's self-esteem. So again, he uses the psychological studies to argue that these children have major self-esteem issues because of segregation. The head of the Supreme Court, Justice Earl Warren. So again, the head of the Supreme Court at this time was Earl Warren. Earl Warren, in 1954, read the Supreme Court's unanimous decision on Brown versus Board of Education. So again, the Supreme Court voted unanimously and said that segregation in schools is unconstitutional. While many argue that this is the second Emancipation Proclamation, that's what a nickname for Brown versus Board of Education is, a second Emancipation Proclamation, there were still a lot of limits. For one, this did not outlaw segregation anywhere else besides public schools. So again, this does not outlaw segregation anywhere else but public schools. It was also up to the states to implement this. So it's up to the states to end segregation, and many of them put up resistance to doing so. Now we're going to zoom in on this Southern resistance. As I just said, it was up to the states to implement the Brown versus Board decision, but many in the South opposed it. For example, in the Southern Manifesto, you don't need your Chromebook. So again, there's the Southern Manifesto, in which 101 members of Congress condemned the Supreme Court. So again, 101 members of Congress condemned the Supreme Court's decision. You also have states putting up in statewide resistance to desegregation. For example, In Virginia, white students would be given money to attend private schools, which could be segregated. Because again, only public schools were desegregated. Some Southern states even outlawed having the NAACP. This resistance to desegregation in education reached its climax with the Little Rock Nine. In 1956, the governor of Arkansas used the state's National Guard to prevent the Little Rock nine African American students from entering the high school. However, President Eisenhower resisted this, sent down federal troops to protect the Little Rock Nine from violence. And despite these victories, it was still very difficult. In 1964, 10 years after the Supreme Court decision, less than 2% of Black students in the South attended integrated schools. So again, 10 years later, less than 2% of Black students attend integrated schools. Kamaya, I saw your chat. At the very end during the X ticket, we can come back to any places where we might need me to repeat. I just want to make sure we get through everything. The next significant chapter in the civil rights movement is in Montgomery. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks, who was a department store worker in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to surrender her seat on a city bus. She refused to surrender her seat on a city bus to a white rider, as the local law required. Parks was arrested, and in response, there was a year-long bus boycott. This bus boycott helped lead to the end of segregation in public transportation. And in November of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public transportation is unconstitutional. And while at the time, Rosa Parks was depicted as an ordinary woman who was just fed up with Jim Crow, in fact, she was a veteran of the civil rights movement and had been working for the civil rights movement since the 1930s and 40s. Now we're going to zoom in on leader Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. is most famous for his pacifist rhetoric. And in his most famous speech, I Have a Dream, given in 1963, he began focusing on the unfulfilled promise of emancipation. King used his rhetoric to try to appeal to the both Blacks' sense of injustice and the conscience of white America. King was also a student of nonviolent civil disobedience. And he believed the best way to combat the hate of segregation was with Christian love. And because of this rhetoric, he was able to appeal to white America by emphasizing his devotion to America's values. In 1957, Martin Luther King formed the SCLC. The SCLC stands for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So again, the SCLC stands for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which organized ministers in churches in the South to get behind the civil rights struggle. This group advocated for nonviolent protest, alongside the SCLC, we also see the foundation of the SNCC. The SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Mike, can you play your head up, please? So again, the SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. which organized the efforts of college students who were participating in sit-ins. A sit-in is when a Black college student or teenager would go to a segregated restaurant, sit down, and refuse to leave until they were served. By the 1960s, African Americans are using sit-ins in restaurants, hotels, buildings, libraries, pools, transportation. And while these sit-ins were successful, progress was slow. In 1961, the SNCC organized the Freedom Rides. In the Freedom Rides, African Americans would ride throughout the South to test whether or not the Southern states were obeying Supreme Court's rulings on desegregation. And often they were greeted with violence and arrests throughout the South. Now, as we discussed earlier, public education had been desegregated. However, those decisions in Brown versus Board did not spread into higher education. At the same time as the early civil rights movement, you have newly elected JFK, who had to decide how much he would support the civil rights movement. So in JFK's early presidency, something big happens. In 1962, James Meredith was a young African-American Air Force veteran who was attempting to enroll in the University of Mississippi. And he was met with resistance as he attempted to attend the university. However, Kennedy decides to send in 3,000 troops to control mobs and ensure Meredith was allowed to attend his classes. At the same time, in 1963, over in Alabama, Governor George Wallace was trying to stop an African-American student from entering the University of Alabama. And once again, Kennedy sends in troops to protect the students. Eddie, let's go. However, in all of these early civil rights movements, all of this really comes to a head in Birmingham. In 1963, these movements for civil rights were spreading throughout the South. In Birmingham, Alabama, was a city of the Deep South that had a history of violence against Black Americans. In Birmingham was a city where the civil rights movement was unable to make a lot of progress. So, Martin Luther King Jr. goes to Birmingham. And after being arrested for violating segregation laws, King writes the letter from Birmingham jail. In the letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. writes to the local ministers and condemns them for asking him to be patient while waiting for desegregation. In this letter, Martin Luther King speaks directly to white moderates and asks that they commit themselves to racial justice. As the protests in Birmingham continued, the police chief ordered attacks on men, women, and children with nightsticks, fire hoses, and attack dogs. The televised images of this repression of civil rights led Kennedy to fully embrace the civil rights movement alongside many white Americans. What happens in Birmingham is what forces white Americans to choose whether or not they are going to support the civil rights movement. This was continued after the assassination of Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was an NAACP official of Mississippi. He was assassinated and right about at the same time, there was a bombing in a Black church in Birmingham that killed 4 young girls, which put all American eyes on the civil rights movement. And so later in the summer, on August 28th, 1963, 250,000 Black and white Americans marched on Washington. And this is often called the high point of the civil rights movement. It's the largest protest in American history up to that time. Marchers called for a passage of a civil rights bill and ultimately jobs and freedom. At the Lincoln Memorial, King gave his most famous speech, "I Have a Dream," and called on President Kennedy to do something. Unfortunately, Kennedy is assassinated just a few months later, but Lyndon B. Johnson does pick up the role that Kennedy had as the president during the Civil Rights Movement. And in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, which officially ends racial discrimination in employment, hospitals and schools, and all privately owned places like restaurants, hotels, and theaters. It also helped end discrimination in employment. Later that year, Johnson also signs the 24th Amendment, which abolishes the collection of the poll tax. However, in all of the great things that the Civil Rights Act does, it does not say anything about Blacks' rights to vote in the South. And this leads to the start of the Freedom Summer of 1964. In the Freedom Summer, hundreds of white college students come from the North down into the South to help protect their African American allies in participating in their right to vote. This led to a lot of physical violence and also highlighted the federal government's indifference to protections of voting rights. After another violent protest in Montgomery, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This act ends literacy tests and provides federal protection in polling places. And now, for the first time since Reconstruction, many African Americans are able to vote. I want to make sure we get through this slide because this one is important. Yes, okay. Alongside all of the peaceful civil rights movement, we also see the rise of the Black Power movement. Led by one of its leaders, he wasn't the only leader, one of the leaders was Malcolm X, who argued that African Americans had to control the political and economic resources of their own communities. So again, he argues that Blacks have to have control of their own political and economic resources and to avoid working with the white community. He was a critic of King's nonviolent movement. And he believed that true civil rights could never be protected underneath King's attempt at nonviolent civil rights. while Malcolm X did have a slight change of heart after his Mecca after his trip to Mecca, as he was Muslim, he was assassinated shortly after, and unfortunately was unable to leave a consistent ideology or organization for African Americans to rally behind. He was the father of the slogan Black Power, which was popularized by Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was a former leader of the SNCC. And members of the Black Power movement saw the limitations of civil rights and nonviolence, and believed that the federal government was not doing enough to ensure protection of their civil rights. This is also when we start to see the popularization of African American dress and hairstyles. And this is when the term shifts to being Afro-American or African American when referring to the groups. This is when we also see the creation of the Black Panther Party, which was formed in Oakland, California in 1966. While the Black Panther Party did work together to use firearms as protection, that's usually only what the media showed, they also included social programs. For example, the Black Panther Party worked together to get free breakfast to thousands of children. They also opened free medical clinics and legal clinics for Black Americans. I am gonna have to stop there, unfortunately. That was basically everything. Well, there's obviously not everything. Go ahead and transition onto the exit ticket. Make sure you complete it. It will be graded. Utilize your notes. Should have gotten to everything, yes. Please let me know if you have any questions, and the video of the lecture will be posted in just about an hour, so that way you can follow up with any other questions or anything that you might have missed. If you have any questions about the lecture, feel free to chat me as well. Awesome. Once I see that you've submitted the exit ticket and you click turn in on Google Classroom, you will be free to go.